Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention, good evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Baker Institute this evening for a discussion about refugee and resettlement issues, one of the key issues on the international agenda today. I'd like to thank Rice University's Boniek Institute for Religious Tolerance, the Mayor of Houston's office, and the UNHCR for their partnership in hosting this event. This is a timely and important topic as crises around the world have displaced millions of people. In 2016, the UN estimated the global number of displaced people, this amazing figure, 65.3 million people in the world, 1 out of every 113 people on Earth. Just think of that. This figure exceeds the number of persons displaced after World War II or in any other time in recent history, if not ancient history. So the international refugee challenge and how it is addressed will shape the world for decades. The city of Houston is a national leader in refugee resettlement. Around 10% of refugees that come to the United States settled here in Texas, 10%, and estimated 30% of whom settle in our city of Houston. These refugees come from every continent and from dozens of countries. So for all these reasons, we are particularly happy to have UN Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, Clements, with us here today. Kelly has been deeply engaged in refugee and displacement issues throughout her 25-year career. Her work with the UNHCR aims to provide vital assistance to refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced, and stateless people. Kelly previously served in the United States Department of State, including as Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. As a Foreign Service officer, she managed a number of U.S. government programs to assist refugee populations in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. She also served in what was my first foreign service assignment before you were born. I was there at the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, Lebanon, so we share that particular experience of serving in lovely Beirut, despite all of its crises. So thank you, the Boniek Center. Thank you for the collaboration we have. Thank you for the Mayor's Office and the UNHCR for this partnership. So please join me in welcoming Kelly Clements to the podium.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador Tajarian. And I want to thank the Baker Institute for Public Policy and Ms. Paula Sanders and the Boniek Institute for Religious Tolerance and the Mayor's Office for hosting me on this, my first trip, not just to Houston, but to Texas. I know. It's shocking, isn't it? It's a particular pleasure for me, as I have family in both Austin and in Franklin, but we seem to meet in other parts of the country for our family reunions, so I never did make it to Texas. And they spent a long time in Houston, so I've heard what a hospitable place this is, and it's nice to be able to come and experience it firsthand. Special thanks goes to Ani Blair, from the Houston Mayor's Office of Trade and International Affairs for the inspiration to come to Texas and the effort she's made to get me here. She's a dear friend and who I've admired for years for her commitment to public service and the impact that she has personally had on the lives of some of the most vulnerable people in the world. And I've seen her in action actually just outside of Baghdad in very difficult circumstances. Before I speak to you about the current displacement crisis, outlining the scale, the magnitude, and the multiple aspects of our response to this, I'd like to play a short film. It is short. I think it's about 6 or 7 minutes long. And this, I hope, will provide some context for our discussions this evening, anchoring those in the experiences of flight and exile that so many people continue to experience. So we'll hope for technology.
Cuando tenía 2 o 3 años, estaba viviendo con la mamá y mi papá, mi abuela, Graciela, y mi abuela salió a lavar los platos del almuerzo, y cuando ella salió a lavarlos, ella la mataron y yo estaba ahí con mi primo.
Mi papá lo mataron. Yo no estaba seguro como, digamos, las personas que lo mataron tal vez iban a venir a mi familia a matar a los demás.
Todo el pueblo que había delincuencia, mataban mucho a gente y también mataron a un tío mío con un machete, lo mataron.
Mataban a personas, lo tiraban en la calle 11, lo mataron por gay, por maricón, dice. Terriblemente, si se supiera como hoy en día, mañana te podrían hallar en la calle muerto.
Es la delincuencia, hay muchas maras tratando de presionar a los jóvenes porque fácilmente se dejan influenciar.
Ya, o sea, una pandilla quería que yo entrara a ser parte de ellos, porque si no, o sea, y me iban a matar. Bueno, la primera vez me dijeron que me iban a matar a mí, entonces yo les dije que no, porque yo no quería.
Tengo a mi hermana y ellos tratan de acosar a mi hermana porque cuando miraban la oportunidad de que no había nadie a su alrededor, trataban de tocarla, cosas así. Ella no se puede defender. Mi abuelo ya está un poco señor, ya está mayor, no puede hacer mucho, entonces dicen, vamos a matar a tu abuelo, le vamos a hacer algo a tu hermana. Son muchas amenazas. Psicológicamente te van matando.
No podíamos estar hasta las 8 de la noche o 9 en la calle porque ellos mataban a la gente que estaba en esa hora afuera.
Muchas veces, o sea, los pandilleros matan a personas enfrente de la policía. Entonces la gente como que en la policía ya...
Sabías si ibas a vivir o no. Tenías que tomar la decisión de tirarte o seguir. Eran dos cosas, o quieres vivir o quieres terminar.
Sufres de muchas cosas porque te encuentras con un clima muy diferente, te da frío por las noches, a veces no tienes que comer. Maras también en otros lugares que andan buscando inmigrantes para secuestrarlos, pedir dinero. Fue una situación muy dura.
Pasamos muchas cosas, ¿sabes? Cuando uno viene caminando en un país que no es de uno, es muy, muy difícil.
Y a veces el tren iba por arriba, cuando uno subía, estaba lleno de sangre y estaba terrible.
Sin pensarlo, muchos de ellos pierden la vida, muchos pierden un brazo, una pierna, todas esas cosas, y es muy lamentable ver eso.
Te es obligado a verlo, vimos violaciones de mujeres, tantas cosas, niños, gente que secuestran y tantas cosas que pasan las personas.
Cruzamos el río Bravo, o sea, y luego seguimos caminando para arriba como 2 horas. Y luego, o sea, dijeron los coyotes que esperáramos ahí, que iban a ir a ver cómo estaba el pase, o sea, de migración, y no llegaron. O sea, ellos se fueron y los dejaron botados a nosotros ahí.
Estuvimos ahí y de ahí vino un policía y el policía dijo, nadie corra, y sacó su pistola y dijo, el que corra le disparo. Y entonces yo me paré ahí porque le tengo miedo a las armas de fuego.
Vi que había gente buena y nunca vi lo que vi en mi país, entonces me siento más segura acá.
En mi país, desgraciadamente, es un país muy ignorante y las personas así no tenemos ningún derecho a nada de protección del gobierno. Solo porque sea gay lo saben, lo matan a uno.
Al simplemente salir de la casa, tú tienes que estar preparado para cualquier cosa que va a suceder. Uno va en el bus, uno no se siente seguro. Uno está caminando en la calle, no se siente seguro. Sale del colegio o cualquier parte, no está seguro.
Yo vine a este país para dejar la vida mala, para dejar el miedo y tener sueños como toda la gente lo tiene.
Tuviera miedo porque me quebrarían mis sueños o me los tirarían a la basura.
Cuando estás aquí te das cuenta de las oportunidades, que si trabajas fuerte, que si estudias fuerte, que si tomas un camino por el que quieres ir, si no te das por vencido, puedes lograr muchas cosas.
Tu sueño es demasiado importante para todo el mundo, no solo para ti solo, sino para todo el mundo.
So listening to refugees is a sobering experience, one that 15,000 people that work with UNHCR and countless others who are working with our partner agencies do every day, both here in the United States and across the globe. It's a sobering experience that highlights stories of immense suffering, as we heard from these youth, and terrible hardship, and can be particularly jarring when the stories are those from children. Listening to refugees, too, is humbling, as it highlights the tremendous strength, resourcefulness, resilience, and the yearning that they have to lead peaceful lives with new opportunities in spite of the trauma. The cost of this displacement crisis on individuals is obvious, and it's gut-wrenching. When one considers these children as a group, whether fleeing escalating violence in the Northern Triangle or the conflict in Syria, which is now in its 7th year, the loss of a whole generation is real. By all accounts, countries in crisis and conflict face a mass exodus of its youth and long-term crisis beyond immediate humanitarian impacts. Beyond the physical and psychological scars that refugee children carry into adulthood, many are unable to attend school for long periods of time and lose out on the chance of a formal education. This will have a negative impact on countries' abilities to rebuild themselves and heal the deep wounds that are generated by years of conflict and violence. Forced displacement has become the defining feature of our decade, unfortunately. As old conflicts continue unabated, new conflicts are sparked, leading more, as the ambassador said, to 65 million people on the move. And I expect when our new statistics unfortunately come out in another couple weeks' time, the number will be higher. With nearly 1% of the world's population displaced, this is the highest displacement on record, marking a twofold increase in the last 20 years. Conflict, persecution, generalized violence, and violations of human rights continue to drive people from their homes, forced to flee in search of safety for themselves and for their children. Nearly a third of this population, about 20 million, roughly equivalent to the population of this great state, have been displaced across national boundaries and borders and sought shelter in other countries as refugees. These numbers hide stories of hardship, grief, and loss as people are compelled to flee their homes, their communities, their countries, often left struggling on the margins of communities to rebuild their lives. While no corner of the world has been spared, the situation in the Middle East has drawn particular attention in the last few years. The region continues to suffer heavily from the consequences of conflict and displacement and is home to close to 40% of the world's refugees and displaced people. The devastation caused by the war in Syria since 2011 has forced more than 5 people to cross borders to become refugees, in addition to more than 6.3 million people that are internally displaced within Syria. That means that at least half of the pre-war population is now displaced, many of them multiple times. And life is dire even for those who have not been displaced. 13.5 million people require humanitarian aid, including 4.6 million people in need who are trapped in what we call besieged or hard-to-reach areas that are very hard for agencies like mine to access. In Iraq, 3 million people have been displaced across the country in just 3 years, with an additional 750,000 people displaced from Mosul and surrounding areas since October of last year, when the military operation began in Mosul. And in Yemen, people are exposed to a deadly combination of conflict and economic collapse, with more than 17 million people are food insecure and at risk of famine. There, as in Nigeria and Somalia and South Sudan, we are deeply concerned that history may be repeating itself from 2011, when 250,000 innocent lives were lost on account of famine. It's our collective responsibility to make sure that this doesn't happen again. I just returned from Ethiopia on Friday, where about 800,000 people are displaced within Ethiopia, many now because of drought conditions. And people continue to cross into Ethiopia daily from Somalia for the same reasons. In the Northern Triangle of Central America, where the levels of violence perpetrated by criminal gangs is similar to that seen in countries facing humanitarian crises, more than 160,000 have fled and sought asylum, including more than 60,000 last year alone. This is a quiet crisis, but it's an escalating one. Ongoing crises in other regions do not necessarily draw the same level of attention, media attention, but have equally devastating effects. Since the war broke out in South Sudan in December of 2013, over 1.7 million citizens of that country have fled. They are citing the fear of indiscriminate killings, looting of property, burning of houses, torture, rape, and arrest by government and opposition forces. Close to 1 million of these refugees have been welcomed in Uganda, where they continue to arrive at a rate of over 2,000 people a day. Others are going to Ethiopia and other neighboring countries who struggle to cope. So let's take a step back on this number to make sure that the reality sets in just a bit. 2,000 people cross into a single country every day with little more than the shirts on their backs, searching for security. That's a hard concept to fathom. A global crisis of this scale and magnitude cannot be tackled only by countries receiving these refugees, countries like Ethiopia or Kenya, but requires concerted action by all of us. Countries neighboring the conflict areas, Turkey, for example, which hosts now the largest number of refugees in the world, with over 3 million Syrians, and Uganda, which is the largest refugee host on the African continent, with over 1 million refugees from a dozen different countries, half a dozen different war-torn countries. They provide what we call a global public good. They do this by allowing access to asylum or international protection and grant refugees the ability to enter national systems of healthcare, education, as well as access to job markets. Lest there be any doubt, this comes at a cost when countries like Turkey, estimating that it has contributed over $20 billion to support Syrians in their own country, and the World Bank estimating that Lebanon, a country of 4 million, Lebanese, now hosts over 1 million Syrians. 1 in 4 people in Lebanon are refugees. They estimate, the World Bank, that Lebanon has incurred losses of $13 billion since the onset of the crisis 6 years ago. The fact that close to 9 out of 10 refugees live in low or middle-income countries bears mentioning. In spite of their limited resources and multiple social, political, economic challenges, some of the poorest countries on this earth are providing the greatest support to people forced to flee their homes in search of safety. The need for solidarity and support from other countries, some of them significantly wealthier, is grounded in both our shared history as a community of nations and the international legal framework we have constructed over centuries. International cooperation to tackle refugee crises has a long history and first emerged after the First World War. At the time, the breakup of large multinational empires, wars and famine in Europe and the Middle East had killed tens of millions of people and displaced more. Determined that this devastating conflict would be the war to end all wars, nations coalesced to create the League of Nations to promote international cooperation and to achieve international peace and security. The League of Nations appointed Fridtjof Nansen as the first High Commissioner for Refugees at the time to deal with 1.5 million displaced Russians by the 1917 revolution. It soon became clear that this temporary office was bound to become more permanent as conflict-driven population movements heightened interstate tensions and threatened state security. Despite initial successes, the League of Nations proved unable to prevent a breakdown in cooperation among member states, who retreated to traditional systems of defensive alliances and power blocs. Before long, the war to end all wars was followed by a war that would eventually escalate into the deadliest conflict in human history. In the aftermath of World War II, tens of millions of people were displaced throughout Europe. The devastation from that conflict was made worse by significant levels of displacement. The world responded by attempting to formalize a more robust system of international cooperation, this time under the auspices of the United Nations, dedicated to respect for human rights. Through this new institution, a diverse group of nations drew from their respective legal, religious, philosophical, cultural traditions to give shape to this new commitment and agree upon common rules to protect everyone. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is really a remarkable statement of collective responsibility, proclaiming that every individual, every organ of society shall strive to make this protection universal and effective. This document made clear that human rights provide an essential foundation for peace to endure between nations. Soon thereafter, the world moved quickly to act upon the Declaration's call to protect those rights through progressive measures, domestic and international. My agency, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, or the UN Refugee Agency, was founded in 1950. It was soon followed by the 1951 Refugee Convention. This bedrock of international protection, this convention also confirms the importance of international cooperation. The preamble explains that our shared responsibility for refugees has two ends: protecting individual rights and minimizing interstate tension. These two aspects of our shared responsibility bear repeating. Our responsibility to protect refugees is not only the right thing to do, it is also a self-serving thing to do. King Abdullah II of Jordan said last year at the UN General Assembly, if regional refugee hosts are abandoned and left to fail, the need won't disappear. The crisis will simply spread further, prolonging the time it takes to end this ordeal. From the inception of the conflict, the concept of asylum in antiquity, to the creation of institutions to address the European refugee crises following the world wars, and the response to our current displacement crisis, the world's solidarity to responding to refugee crisis follows a clear pattern. For us, UNHCR, the work of 1,000 partners, it's at its very essence a representation of the world's commitment to its collective responsibility to address displacement. Our staff work in 128 countries, 450 different field operations. 90% are living in the deep field, half are in hardship locations, and emergency operations. We work to support host governments in providing protection and aid to refugees and on the front lines of these displacement crises. Together with partners, we're delivering life-saving aid. We're helping to safeguard refugees' basic rights, and we're developing solutions that allow them to regain control over their lives. Our work in the field includes a wide range of activities that are aimed to provide basic aid to refugees. This can include the most basic of responses: shelter, water, basic health care. It can be setting up camps, which are increasingly rare, I might add, where refugees can find such amenities, shelter, food, and security. In the last decade, this approach has gradually morphed in response to a number of factors, including large-scale displacement and technological advances. Today in the Middle East, for example, just 10% of Syrian refugees, 10%, live in camps, while the rest of Syrian refugees are living with host communities and villages, along with their host community nationals. In response, UNHCR and partners have taken steps to modernize our response. For example, we've set up biometric registration centers, partnered with banks in the region in order to provide cash assistance to the millions that are scattered across cities, towns, and villages in the region. We've worked with academia, other international organizations to better use data at our disposal, ensure that we can proactively identify those who are the most vulnerable and most in need of aid. And we've embraced digital platforms, setting up call centers, secure web-based information sharing platforms, text messaging systems to communicate with refugees, Facebook groups run by refugee outreach workers in Lebanon are a modern-day echo of the megaphone-wielding field workers of the past when I was a protection officer 25 years ago in Bangladesh. While we work to embrace new technologies to communicate and engage with refugees, we are partnering with the private sector to expand connectivity to both refugees but also their host communities. If we can surmount the biggest barrier to connectivity for refugees, the often prohibitive cost of remaining connected, this has the power to transform the way we provide aid to and protect refugees, as well as interact with them. Finally, though perhaps less visibly, much of our work is done with governments to build up and reinforce local systems rather than create separate, parallel systems of support. We've learned lessons of past responses. For example, those to aid Iraqi refugees, where parallel systems were commonplace and unsustainable in places like Jordan. In the short term, this benefits refugees who rely on host governments for health, education, and essential services. In the medium and long term, this benefits host communities. Examples of such activities, including Jordan, where we help the National Family Protection Department, for example, to better serve children, survivors of sexual violence, and in Turkey, where we work to strengthen education systems for refugee kids that are going to Turkish schools. All of these activities, whether in support of refugee hosting countries or directly helping refugees, are funded through voluntary contributions from governments and increasingly from individual private giving. We have mobilized record levels of financial support in recent years, but this has come at a time of desperate need, where such need outstrips available resources. With less of the half of the humanitarian funding needed to meet life-saving needs, refugees and host communities have received only a fraction of the support required, not just to survive, but to thrive. World leaders were acutely aware of the limitations of the current response to the displacement crisis when they gathered last September at the UN Summit on Refugees and Migrants. This summit, the first gathering of heads of state and governments by the UN General Assembly to discuss large-scale movements of refugees and migrants was a historic opportunity to come up with a blueprint for a better international response to such movements, and not a moment too soon. The 193 countries that ended up signing something called the New York Declaration reaffirmed shared responsibility to manage large movements of refugees and migrants in humane, sensitive, compassionate, and people-centered manner. The New York Declaration marked a political commitment of unprecedented force and resonance by the international community. It reaffirms the importance of the international refugee regime and represents a commitment by member states to strengthen and enhance mechanisms to protect people on the move. In adopting the declaration, member states agreed that protecting refugees and countries that shelter them are shared international responsibilities and must be borne more equitably and predictably. They also pledged robust support to host countries affected by these large movements of people, and to this end agreed upon the core elements of a comprehensive refugee regional response framework, and agreed to work towards the adoption of a global compact, if all goes well, next September 2018, for safe, orderly, and regular migration, as well as a global compact on refugees. Critically, the New York Declaration emphasizes that supporting refugees is not a task limited to governments and international organizations, but that civil society, volunteers, faith-based organizations, academic institutions, and the media can and should play an important role. So you may wonder how a crisis of such a scale and magnitude, which has engendered such debates regarding global responsibility sharing, can have local solutions. The answer lies in part to a whole-of-society approach, which is emphasized by the New York Declaration. Just as a crisis of this complexity and scale cannot be resolved by any single country, it cannot be tackled by any single actor. All segments of society have a role to play in seeking solutions to this crisis. At a national level, governments have a key role to address root causes of conflict and displacement through bilateral and multilateral diplomacy. Therein lies the ultimate solution to this crisis, in reaching a resolution of existing wars and preventing the emergence of new violence and conflict. This alone has the power to help millions of displaced return to their homes in safety and dignity voluntarily. They can rebuild their lives, and for the resources, both human and financial, now spent on war to be redirected to peace and development. We would like, frankly, nothing more than to work ourselves out of a job, but that will require political solutions, which to date have been elusive. In the meantime, governments of those countries least affected by the crisis, many of them in the richer parts of the world, will have to continue to shoulder some of the costs of the response. As is currently done, this aid should be channeled both bilaterally and multilaterally. Organizations like mine, UNHCR, need to continue both their work to protect and deliver life-saving aid to displaced people, assisting governments and communities in the front line of managing the crisis. We also have a responsibility to ensure that the aid that we can provide has a greater impact by adopting those innovative approaches I mentioned earlier to how we deliver, leveraging new technologies. In the last couple of years, we've seen the innumerable benefits of extending connectivity to refugees, especially young people, who can then access online education opportunities, financial accounts through banks, and eventually establish a digital identity. Life-saving indeed. We work tirelessly in pursuit of this goal of delivering better, seeking ways to improve how we work, and our impact on the ground with a commitment to ensuring that the voices of displaced communities are central to the conversation to determine the nature and the level of aid that's provided. Civil society in countries at the forefront of the crisis, and increasingly the private sector, play a key role in meeting the needs of displaced populations. Governments, multilateral institutions, non-governmental organizations all have important roles to play in meeting the needs of the displaced. But the unsung heroes of this response are the local communities that have opened their homes to refugees and welcomed them to their communities, sharing their sometimes meager resources to help them. Nowhere was this more clearly visible than in the Somali region of Ethiopia, where I mentioned I was last week. There are some 200,000 refugees there from Somalia, and they have settled in an already impoverished part of the country where the local community itself is struggling to make ends meet. The government has kept their borders open for decades. Waves of displacement from war and famine conditions. In spite of the difficulties, host and refugee communities are sharing land and working together to grow crops to generate an income and support themselves. With strong support from the private sector, in this case the IKEA Foundation, UNHCR, and government partners have put into place sustainable programs to irrigate farmlands so that refugees and Ethiopians can support themselves rather than continue to rely on international or government aid. Build schools to ensure that children have a future, and look at renewable energy to protect the environment while saving resources. The many families that I met in Ethiopia praised the approach, and rarely have I seen such harmony in refugee and host communities in my years of travel. As in Ethiopia and other countries receiving refugees, local communities, businesses, and civil society organizations here in the United States also have a critical role in welcoming refugees. For those who have been pushed out of their country by the trauma of persecution and violence, the benefits of a welcoming community is quite literally life-saving. It's the first step in the long journey to rebuilding a sense of normalcy and feeling the embrace of a society that nurtures and encourages dreams rather than one that throws them in the trash, as Glady, one of the young women we heard from earlier, said about her country of origin. Communities in Texas have a long tradition of hospitality, and the state has welcomed over 10% of the refugees resettled to the U.S. on an annual basis. Not surprisingly, Houston itself is one of the most diverse, actually, I heard today, the most diverse metropolitan areas in America, and 1 in 4 people here in this great city is foreign-born. Texas is itself on the front lines of a displacement crisis. Since 2011, we've seen a surge in arrivals, as you saw in the video, displaced from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Many displaced by organized armed criminal groups or violence in the home. They are fleeing record high homicide rates, sexual violence, disappearances, forced recruitment into armed gangs, and extortion. A substantial number have crossed the border into Texas in the Rio Grande Valley, which has seen the arrival of many children who had fallen victims not just of violence in their own countries, but also to the smugglers who thrive off the human misery that conflict, insecurity, and persecution generates. In a testament to the diversity and progressive nature of the city of Houston, you did not wait for this visit to adopt your own whole-of-society approach through the Welcoming Houston initiative. This plan, calling on a range of public, private, and nonprofit stakeholders, aims to develop best practices on how to better integrate and assist newly arriving Houstonians in the city. As with the 1951 Refugee Convention, the initiative recognizes that working together with new Houstonians, including refugees, is not just the right thing to do, it is also in the economic interests of the city, with foreign-born residents contributing more than $116 billion to the city's economy in 2014. I couldn't speak here in my home country of the global displacement crisis without mentioning resettlement. The current crisis is marked not just by the scale of displacement, but also by the lack of solutions for people who are fleeing for their lives. In 2015, barely 1% of refugees were able to return home safely. Less than 0.5% were naturalized in their country of first asylum, and less than 1% were resettled to third countries like the United States. The remaining 98% of the world's refugees remain in limbo, with little more than the hope that conditions in their home countries will improve and allow them to return home to rebuild their lives. Now, while resettlement is a solution for a very tiny number of refugees, when you look at the overall population, it's an important tool to provide protection to refugees at risk in the country where they sought asylum or separated from family members by conflict or during their flight. It is for the most vulnerable of vulnerable refugees. We often think that people who have managed to escape from persecution and war and cross into another country have made it to safety. For many, this is a fact. And once in exile, they can focus on settling in and reestablishing their lives, waiting the situation out until they can return home. But many are not so lucky. For some, such as Nahas, a 28-year-old Syrian man from Idlib in northwestern Syria, leaving their home is merely the first step in reaching safety. Nahas, who is gay, had to flee Syria for fear that his father would report him to local militia because of his sexual orientation. His story mirrors that of Brian, who you may remember from the video at the beginning, and who fled his country in Central America at 13 years of age for the same reason. For members of the LGBTI community live on the margins of society throughout the world, where being gay is often illegal and punishable in places by imprisonment or death. This is why Nahas received assistance from California-based nonprofits, the Organization for Refuge, Asylum, and Migration, and the Jewish Family and Community Services, East Bay, to resettle in the U.S. For Nahas, as for many others, resettlement saves lives. Texas is well aware of the challenges and rewards of resettlement for both host communities and newly arrived refugees. You know how important it is not just to welcome, but also integrate new families into your community, in your schools, in your economy, and in your services. The United States has a proud tradition of resettlement, with lessons now being learned by other countries on its success, including the model adopted here in Texas. Let us harbor no illusions. Resettlement is not the solution to the entire refugee crisis, as I mentioned. It is helping very, very small number of people. But it is a solution, one that is locally achievable and offers tangible benefits to both refugees and the local community, together with other actors trying to find solutions to the global crisis of displacement, local communities and businesses, governments at the national, regional, and local levels, NGOs and multilateral organizations, and of course the displaced themselves. It represents an important solution we have to the current crisis. So thank you for your support for refugees, and thanks again to the Baker Institute and the City of Houston for inviting me here today. Thank you. Yep, happy to.
Is open to questions. Just raise your hand and introduce yourself, and please ask the question. Not a speech.
Please.
I'm Mark. So, hello. My question is, how does your agency deal with security? I mean, that's the whole issue with Trump and everything is refugees, security, and things like that, and that's why, and crime. So, how do you deal with those issues?
Sure. A couple of points about our role, UNHCR. We have the privilege of following refugees through their life cycle as refugees. And one thing I did not mention is just how long that life cycle can be these days. Protracted displacement is now also the watchword, where on average, refugees, once they leave their homes, are displaced or in refugee-like situations for over 20 years. So we get to know a whole lot about those refugees. They're registered, often when they cross the border, either with ourselves or with the governments that are hosting them. They, in many places, for example, in the Middle East now, where I mentioned this, we have evolved in terms of using biometrics so that we know who they are and where they've been. And so we follow those refugees really until there's a solution, whether or not it's a voluntary return or third country resettlement or what have you. What we do is we identify people that are, as I mentioned, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. So those that, whether or not they're female-headed households, have particular medical issues, somehow are not going to be able to find a solution in their countries of asylum. These cases, these families, are then referred to countries who have said, we will look at resettlement. And it is up actually to those countries then to look at, does this family meet its own national definition of a refugee? In the case of the US, that is not the same thing as the Refugee Convention definition. So it's the national laws of the United States that govern who can actually come into the country and who can't. In the case, for example, of the United States, and I know this more from my past association than my current association, there are a large number of security checks that then are put into place for those refugees that may be coming to this country. That's not something that the UN Refugee Agency has anything to do with. That's entirely a national responsibility. To the extent that we can share information, and we do, as we refer a family to a country like the US or Sweden or Canada, we will share with them too what we know about that family. So there's a lot of back and forth in terms of, who it is that we are referring. But ultimately it comes to the country who's receiving the family to determine secure, not secure, yes, no. It's a national response. Thank you. Please.
Hi, Sarah Kaufman with the Regional Refugee Office here in Houston. I have a question about the in-country processing of Central American minors and what the KMAOR program, they call it, right? Do you know anything about the future of that program? Or what's UNHCR's view on that program just in general?
That is a great question, and I'm not sure I'm deep enough to know. I almost want to call on my colleague Tina if she knows more than I do. I was familiar, obviously, with the start of the program because it was about 2.5 years before I joined the UN that it came up and started functioning. I think it's still getting off the ground in terms of referrals, in terms of in-country processing. My understanding is that is continuing in collaboration, coordination with the regional governments. From the UN perspective, anything that we can find that provides another safety valve, another way to protect people, we are fully supportive. And we've tried to offer our support, assistance, what have you, in terms of making whatever it is that the US, in this case, needs in order to make that processing operation happen. Its future, I really couldn't say. I don't know. Way in the back.
Hi, my name's Lisa Brooks. I am involved with a small political action group, and we have done supply drives for refugees that we've donated to Interfaith Ministries of Greater Houston. But since our focus is political, is there anything politically that we can do to help welcome refugees, and maybe from a policy perspective, people we can call?
You're talking to an apolitical organization. We're the humanitarian arm of the United Nations. So, a welcoming environment, the need for international protection, treating people in a dignified way, allowing people's individual stories to be heard. The worst is not to have, especially a story of persecution, available to those that are going to be making a decision on those people's futures. That I would say, basic protection would be the number one ask.
Great.
Thank you. There was another question. Yes, please.
My name is Benjamin Kavis. I work with the African Law Center. And my question to you is there a mechanism put in place by your agency to assist these refugees with legal assistance, or especially in the camps at any point? Because we're trying to reach out, but sometimes with the government, since you said most of the laws are different in every country, and every country is responsible for defining who can attain asylum. So is there something that your agency does by probably managing the legal organizations and maybe kind of like connecting them to the local refugee population.
Right. So we are a protection agency, and probably what you've identified as one of our greatest responsibilities in countries is to help local authorities, national governments, and so on provide this kind of legal aid and assistance to refugees that are coming across. Yes, we partner with a number of, it's often not just us that we would do it. We would partner with local organizations, civil society organizations that frankly know the context far better than we do. So it depends which area you're talking about, but often the UNHCR office in a particular country will be able to link up with those local organizations that we're working with. So yes, indeed we do. The extent to which we work on this depends on how strong the government is in terms of their own ability. In a place like Turkey, for example, they basically manage the response from beginning to end. They register refugees. They refer those refugees to countries like the U.S. in terms of resettlement. We have far less to do with the domestic legislation, some of the legal aid issues, although we still are involved. But other countries may need a lot more support, and we're there.
Would it matter if I throw in this other question that in terms of them actually writing their stories? Because my understanding is that your agency and probably the local government does the background and the storytelling of these people to actually determine whether their story is credible enough for them to gain the status of a refugee or an asylum seeker. So at any point in time, is there a role that your agency plays?
Yes. We listen to those stories. When I mentioned to this gentleman that we're following the life cycle of a refugee, often that story, if it's an individual one, if it's not what we call prima facie, which would be a whole group that have been recognized as refugees, if we're doing individual determinations, we would sit down with the entire family and go through their story not once but several times and document it. Yes. Please.
Ruth Ann Scaff, the granddaughter of grateful immigrants. But would you tell us about schooling for these children? You said half the refugees are children.
Yes. I would say probably the biggest impact of the financial situation that I mentioned earlier are on some of what some determine as less than life-saving. You know, on the scale of things, I would say that education can be life-saving, by the way. But if you're looking at, do we feed someone today, or do we send them to school? Often when we have to make these hard choices, it's education that suffers. Now, our goal is obviously to get every child in school, and working very strongly with those host governments in order to do that, because we, like I said, we want to use national systems. We want to reinforce education. But as it turns out, I mean, half of refugees are kids, and half of those kids are out of school. And it's for all kinds of reasons. It's access, it's the lack of resources, it's the fact that we need to get to the kids before they then become income earners for their families, all kinds of reasons. So it's quite difficult. So half are in school, primary school, I should say. Only 22% of refugees are in secondary school, in high school. And less than 1% are in a tertiary or a university setting like this one. So we have a long way to go. Where I would say that there is a glimmer of hope is that there's more attention now on this issue being a priority than there ever has been, for the reasons that I mentioned. It's the future. It's trying to prevent a lost generation. So we have many more partners now, not just traditional partners, who are very much dedicated to protection. It can be, what we would like is not necessarily to establish the 12,000 schools that are required to keep up with the number of refugees in a particular year, but that we look at technology for how do we extend distance learning, for example, some of the non-formal education tools that we might have at our disposal. So rather than training teachers and having physical classrooms, trying to find ways to reach more kids. And those kids that have lost years being in displacement, trying to give them the non-formal education, the catch-up support that they need, so that we aren't talking to 13-year-olds that are in 4th grade or 5th grade, but that we can see them in classes of kids their own age and getting a good education. So it's a high priority for us. It tends to, unfortunately, be sacrificed at times when we don't have the funding to support the overall response. Thank you. Yes?
Hi, I'm Shereen Herman. I work for the Houston School District, actually.
Oh, good. Yeah.
I have a two-part question, actually.
Yeah.
One was what you say communities are the answer to resettlement. And I was curious what you've heard about Houston, because I have my own answers about why Houston does so well with refugee resettlement. But if you have anything specific to impart to us about what you've heard out there. And number two also was, how do you deal with the secondary trauma that I'm sure that you have visit places? What do you do with that? Because there are actually a lot of people in this room who work with refugees, and we all have that.
Oh, personally, you mean?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. Good questions. So what did I hear about Houston? Interesting. First, it's been an incredible day. I mean, I've only been here for 24 hours, so I hate to tell you what you know far better than I about this great city. The diversity obviously helps. It's to have people that are coming from someplace else talking to others who are recently arrived. There's something in terms of that connection that you can't replace. The fact that you have the kind of support, and many of you, I've recognized some that I saw today, that you have the kind of support system in place already in terms of referral, in terms of some of the services that refugees would need soon upon arrival, absolutely helps. You know, we know language can be difficult. We know that the struggle to find employment quite quickly, to start being able to support one's own family as opposed to the agencies coming in to support, all that helps. Leadership is hugely important, and you have a mayor that clearly has embraced both the refugee program, but diversity generally, the immigrant-friendly environment that Houston represents. Leadership is very important, and then the support I think that you've received both on the federal level until recently, but also what those agencies that are here locally are able to provide. Has been quite helpful. The secondary trauma is a tough one. I would say that in the 28 years, I guess it now is, of being somehow associated with this, you try not to compartmentalize. You try to be in the moment with the person and the family that you're talking to allow it to affect, but also then have an outlet when you've left that particular situation. And we have found, particularly in the Europe crisis, surprisingly, one of the most upsetting and difficult crises for people who work for my agency have had ever. Now, why, you might say, why is that? Somebody working in Greece, how difficult can that be? Well, I know many of you know what happened on the shores of Greece in terms of not saving a lot of lives and pulling bodies out of the water. And those that perhaps were helping, not helping to shepherd, but being along the journey as people were going north, not being in a position of being able to provide information was perhaps one of the most difficult things that my team has encountered. We are used to having the answers. We're used to having the places that people can go to get support. We're used to being able to tell you that a border is open or a border is closed. And in the Europe crisis, we could do none of those three things. We didn't know what was going to be happening later that day, the next day. It was a completely dynamic situation. We didn't know where people were going to be moving. And that, to be an agency that's used to helping, not being able to be in a position of helping, I think was a tremendously difficult experience. So how did we cope with that? I wasn't in Greece, I should tell you, but I was in Serbia and in Hungary during the times that, for example, all of the Syrians were stuck at the train station and the trains were not running and they didn't know where they were going to be going next. A lot of the way that we coped or suggested our team cope is to talk to others, to remove yourself after a certain period, to be able to enable yourself to grieve, ideally not with the people that you're trying to help, and then to be able to experience it with others that are in a similar situation. There's really nothing that replaces that. Thank you. I'm not looking over there, and I don't mean to. Yes, I'll come back to you. Yes, please.
Yes, Jim Tucker. Thank you for discussing a few minutes ago some of the process, because I know some of us over the past months have gotten increasingly familiar with the 16 or 18 steps involved in this. The scope of the potential problem, not the folks who qualify as refugees and through that process, but just oppressed cultural groups and other threatened folks around the world. What's the multiplier from the acknowledged refugees to the threatened or the potential problems around the world? Thank you.
I'm not sure that I understand the question exactly in terms of...
What's over the horizon in terms of...
additional displacements, you mean?
Yeah, the DPs and other...
Yes, okay, I'm with you.
Sort of next year's news, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, this is, hopefully it came out a bit in the remarks. What I think is, in addition to the ongoing conflict in some of these areas, what makes today an increasingly complex environment is the overlay of other factors besides persecution, war, violence, as if that isn't enough. If you overlay economic deprivation, the environment, drought-related conditions, famine, and you have that all mixed together along with some of the security issues in terms of the non-state actors and others that are directly targeting civilians. Sorry to leave you in a very depressing comment, but I don't see it getting better. Not soon anyway, not without concerted action. Now, one thing that my old boss and now Secretary General has made a priority is prevention and a focus on peace and security. Now, if we can, as United Nations, and when I say that, I don't mean the bodies, the organizations, the funds and programs of which we are one of the UN, but the member states agree that this is a priority, and we start addressing some of these movements from its core, looking at the root causes, we might see a change. But he's going to need a lot of help to do that, including by this government. And I think he's got huge challenges, whether or not it's the hot spots in terms of the peace and resolution of conflict, but also to address those, what might be tomorrow's crisis. So I unfortunately see it getting worse before getting better, although I'm a glass half full person. So I think he has a little time to help all of us in terms of making it possible for some people to go home. Thank you.
One more question.
Right in the back there.
My name's Richard Dowdy. I'd be interested to know a bit more about if UNHCR has any relationship or is doing anything about the people who exploit and abuse refugees, from coyotes who can be facilitators on the one hand, but also exploiters and abusers, people who drain families of their life savings to put them on a terribly unsafe boat. Is there a relationship? Is there anything UNHCR is doing to help people get safe passage?
Yeah, it's a little outside of our scope because we're dealing with the symptoms. We're dealing with people on the run. Where we try to link in is obviously with the local law for enforcement of the countries we're dealing with. In Greece, for example, whether or not it's those that are moving through different passages, the best that we can do is provide the information that we have to local law enforcement. And now what they do with it as a result, that we don't have much influence over. But one of the things that we have said is, for example, in the case of the Europe crisis, the not providing orderly and humane border management, allowing refugees or asylum seekers the chance to tell their story, to whether or not they're a refugee or may not be a refugee, that only helped smugglers and traffickers. So we've very much said from an advocacy point of view, this is to advantage those that want to make a buck off of people's lives. And that's something that we could prevent with something that's much more organized from an international scale. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Join me in